At 22:16 hours, we got a call that a man was acting erratically in the store. He was acting like a maniac. When we arrived on the scene, the store had been emptied of its customers because of the behavior of this gentleman. It took us a while to control the situation, and there was some frustration involved. We've had 3 incidences this week. I wouldn't go as far as to say epidemic. They're annoying.
Greetings everyone old and new, welcome to Haseo Reviews, and good news, I'm finally free from my 2D prison! Hotspot hasn't escaped yet though, so he's, well... Yeah, we'll worry about that later. Anyways, Crash Bandicoot!
Crash Bandicoot, a name that carries such a long, tumultuous legacy. Originally created and developed by the now legendary Naughty Dog, this early trilogy of platformers, along with a kart racer, but that's for another time, were not only some of the first successful attempts at bringing the traditionally 2D exclusive platforming genre to 3D with the advent of the 5th generation of consoles, the first ones capable of 3D polygonal gaming without relying on accessories or custom chips, but were also some of the games that helped cement the PlayStation's dominance through the remainder of the 90s. Crash Bandicoot, Crash Bandicoot 2, Cortex Strikes Back, and Crash Bandicoot Warped are 3 games that many people wax nostalgic over, but you know that won't fly here. I did play a handful of the Crash games in my childhood, but I never really got into them like many other PlayStation kids did. So instead of parroting the general consensus about the Naughty Dog Crash games, I'll be looking at all 3 in one video to see whether they all hold up to scrutiny nearly 25 years later. 3 decently long platformers in one video, Primus help me. Dr. Neo Cortex, assisted by his henchman Dr. Nitrous Brio, plans to conquer the world with an army of mutated, rapidly evolved animals, with his latest creation, Crash Bandicoot, to be his general. However, his attempt to brainwash Crash into servitude fails, and Crash makes a Looney Tunes-style escape. Undaunted, Cortex intends to use his next subject, Crash's girlfriend Tawna, for experimentation. Crash washes up on the beach of Insanity Island and must work his way through all 3 Wumpa Islands, defeating Cortex's minions along the way to save Tawna and stop Cortex's evil plots. The plot of Crash Bandicoot is your bog standard, hero saves the damsel from the bad guy archetype, but seeing as video games, especially children's games of the era, were often light on plot to begin with, it works well enough. I do wish that the cutscene setting this all up actually played before the title screen, rather than making the player wait a while for it to play, meaning that the average player might unintentionally skip it, but it's not too big of an issue to spoil my enjoyment. The models used in the cutscene are, how can I put this kindly? Lacking. Cortex, Brio, Crash, and Tawna all lack expressive faces or even the most basic mouth movements, looking less like they're actually acting out what was storyboarded and more like an early, unfinished build of what the finished cutscene was intended to look like. Surprisingly, most if not all of the minimal voice acting in Crash Bandicoot was provided by a single person, Brendan O'Brien, who would continue to voice Crash and several other characters in the franchise until 2001's Crash Bandicoot: The Wrath of Cortex. His Crash performance, much like Charles Martinet's performance as Mario, is iconic, setting the standard for what everyone now pictures when they think of Crash Bandicoot's... well, voice is kind of stretching it. He's mostly non-verbal, apart from the occasional or a stark contrast to certain other attitude-filled mascots of the era, or hell, even the commercials for the game.
Hey, plumber boy, mustache man, your worst nightmare has arrived.
On the other hand, Cortex and Brio's voices don't quite click with me. I feel that some of their later voice actors suited their characters better. As one of the very first attempts at making a 3D platformer, Naughty Dog decided to do, well, exactly that. Transition a 2D game style into 3D. Crash can only move in 8 directions, as opposed to the full 360-degree movement of Mario 64 the same year. Levels are designed as hallways that funnel the player down a specific path, with the occasional side-scrolling 2D section in a handful of levels. Enemies can be defeated by either jumping on them in traditional Mario style, or by using Crash's signature ability, his spin attack. Let me tell you, this, right here, this is one of the most satisfying basic attacks in any game I've ever played. I don't know if it's the whirling sound of the spin, or just the way the enemies hit by it fly off into the background with a bullet ricochet sound, but whatever it is, it, combined with most enemies only dying in one hit, makes combat a breeze. However, the enemies aren't the only one-hit point wonders in this game, for Crash also dies in only one hit, unless he's protected by an Aku Aku mask. Aku Aku masks can be found in some of the many crates littered throughout the stage, which mostly contain either Wampa Fruit, collecting 100 grants an extra life, Crash Bandicoot's smiling face, which also grants an extra life, or the faces of Tawna, Brio, or Cortex. Collecting 3 of the same face tokens takes Crash to a bonus round, but I'll discuss those more in depth later. Breaking a marked Aku Aku crate, or occasionally just finding him floating in harder to reach parts of the stage, grants Crash with an additional hit point. Collecting 2 changes Aku Aku's color and gives Crash yet another hit point. Collecting a third one on top of that makes Crash wear Aku Aku on his face, turning him briefly invincible and making him run faster, all accompanied by a groovy bongo beat. In fact, most of the soundtrack is made of earworms, songs that get stuck in your head and never really leave. Composers Josh Mansell and Devo frontman Mark Mothersbaugh did an excellent job of creating a soundtrack that, while small in its song count, masterfully captures the mood of a level. All that Crash has to do to progress through the game is reach the end of each level. However, for the more hardcore, or I'd argue masochistic among you watching this, there's an added layer of challenge to Crash Bandicoot. One that, unfortunately, kneecaps the rest of the game and keeps me from recommending it to anyone who isn't already familiar with platformers of the era and who's willing to forgive outdated mechanics. Breaking every single crate in a stage rewards Crash with a gem. I'm sorry, did I say breaking every single crate in a stage? I meant breaking every single crate in a stage without dying a single time rewards you with a gem, because dying even once causes the game to skip the end level results screen and warp you straight to the world map. Now, why does this clearly upset me so much? Simple. First, not all crates can be accessed in every stage on your first visit, because they may require a special color gem to open new pathways. Second, you aren't shown how many crates are in a given stage, only how many you missed, and even then, only if you beat the stage without dying once, at which point the player is shown a comedic animation of every crate they miss falling from the sky and breaking on Crash's head. With no way to check how many crates you've broken at a given time, how is the player supposed to know if they've missed anything? Lastly, collecting a gem is one of only 2 ways to save your progress, the other being the aforementioned bonus rounds. These are simple side-scrolling platforming challenges that often reward the player with extra lives and contain more crates that, I believe, count towards the stage's total crate number. Correct me if I'm wrong. And reaching the end saves the player's progress up to that point. At least in the Tawna bonus rounds. Oh, and did I mention that while every single stage has a gem, not every stage contains a Tawna bonus round? This means the player isn't free to save at will, so if they aren't skilled enough to get each gem on their first try, forced backtracking notwithstanding, or if they fail a Tawna bonus round, which I should also mention you only get 1 shot at, they have to replay whatever they didn't manage to save every time they turn the game off, even if it's sections they had already completed. This asinine limitation on letting the player save their game is one of the 2 key points that I see as being the biggest flaws with the original Crash Bandicoot. I'll get to the second in a bit because I need a breather from all that ranting. There are 2 other types of bonus rounds in Crash Bandicoot, as I alluded to before. The second are Brio bonus rounds, which consist of tricky platforming sections littered with these TNT crates. TNT crates also appear in regular gameplay, and are easily identified by their dull red color and bright yellow TNT letters plastered on them. These crates explode when spun, killing Crash, so instead the player has to jump on them, which sets off a 3-second countdown before it explodes. They also destroy all crates surrounding them as long as they're within the explosion's radius, but only if they're on screen when they explode. If Crash sets off a TNT timer and then goes on his merry way, the TNT crate will explode, but the crates surrounding it will be left intact, and if you weren't aware of this, you'd most likely go mad wondering where that last handful of crates you missed were. Lastly are the Cortex bonus rounds, which I missed both of and therefore have nothing to comment on. Oops. For a couple of stages, Crash will forcibly mount and ride on a rampaging boar. In these instances, the boar moves forward automatically at a fixed speed, and the player can only move left, right, and jump over obstacles, because colliding with anything results in losing a life. The only other departure from the standard beginning to end platforming stages are the occasional boss fights. These are, for the most part, about dodging the boss's attacks and hitting them when they expose their weak point. Rinse and repeat until each boss is down for the count. Every boss switches up their attack patterns after each hit, however, so it ultimately becomes a game of trial and error. Even with these strict rules in place, none of the bosses pose much of a threat, because they clearly telegraph all of their attacks. Crash begins every fight with 2 Aku Aku masks, and none of the boss's attacks are particularly hard to dodge. Even Cortex, the final boss of the game, doesn't put up much of a threat. So, deep breath. I think it's about time for that second rant about Crash's other biggest flaw. Crash moves fine enough on the ground, but whenever he's forced to jump, it feels so heavy and so stilted that it's too easy to miss your target, be it an enemy, a crate, or a platform. I swear, Crash's jumping controls are so, for the lack of a better term, clunky, that it feels like pure luck whether or not I land a jump safely, I plummet to my death, or I hit something else that kills me. This, combined with the later stages forcing the player to make pixel and millisecond perfect moving across platforms, disappearing platforms, and occasional disappearing floor, brings Crash Bandicoot's difficulty from comfortably challenging to hair-pullingly rage-inducing. The team at Naughty Dog must have been aware of how hard this game was, because it's incredibly easy to rack up lives, but in the last few stretches of the game, it's just as easy to lose all those lives. This chip I currently have on my shoulder is dedicated to level 24, the lab. I got multiple game overs here, and when I finally did complete it, I didn't feel like I had overcome a massive challenge. I felt like I just got lucky, because most if not all of my deaths were due to jumps I didn't feel like I had enough control over. That's the difference between a fair but tough challenge and poor design and programming. The players should always feel proud when they beat a section that previously gave them trouble, because it should indicate that they're getting better at the game. But with Crash Bandicoot, there's no reward, no feeling of satisfaction, just relief that, assuming you aren't going for 100%, you never have to deal with that bullshit again. On top of all this, there's no gradual upward curve in difficulty like a platformer should have. Instead, the difficulty spikes and dips all over the place, seemingly at random, like there was no coherent structure to what order each level was placed in. This is perfectly summed up by the final stage before the battle with Cortex, which I'm about to show in its entirety. I know that there's an alternate, longer path if you collected all the gems, but the average player isn't going to bother with that, so all they get is a single jump and then the exit. The final battle with Cortex is nothing to write home about. Just dodge his purple and blue shots, spin his green shots back at him, bing, bang, boom, Cortex goes down, Crash saves Tawna, and the two escape on Cortex's blimp while the credits roll. If the player collected every gem, or in my case, entered the secret super password on the password screen and went through the alternate route in the Great Hall, they'll find Tawna waiting for them, allowing them to skip the entire final battle, which also rewards the player with a comedic "Where Are They Now" epilogue that, while humorous, ultimately fails as a 100% completion reward, because all subsequent Crash games would ignore what this ending had to say.
So that's the first Crash Bandicoot, and it hasn't so much aged like fine wine as it has aged like milk. Milk that you left out on the counter for an entire weekend because you were out of town on a convention trip and you were so hyped to get there in the morning that you didn't put up all your breakfast stuff before you left because you wanted to get there as early as possible and came back to find out that the whole gallon of milk that you bought had spoiled. And not that I know that or anything. Anyway, let's move on to Crash Bandicoot 2.
Crash Bandicoot 2. Cortex Strikes Back.
Since the first Crash Bandicoot ended up being a smashing success, selling over 6.8 million copies worldwide and proving that the PS1 could easily handle 3D platformers, Crash Bandicoot 2 was quickly put into production, releasing around 1 year later in 1997. Naughty Dog clearly saw where the original needed improvement, because not only does Crash Bandicoot 2 feature higher quality presentation, with more voice acting, including casting Clancy Brown, more well-known nowadays for voicing Mr. Krabs from SpongeBob, as the new voice of Dr. Cortex, but giving every character new, more expressive models and animations. Crash also feels less heavy and slippery to control, making platforming far less of a hassle than it was previously. Picking up with the defeat of Dr. Cortex at the end of the first Crash Bandicoot, Cortex falls from his airship and crash lands into an underground cavern, where he finds a power crystal. 1 year passes and Cortex has constructed a space station and hired a new henchman, Dr. Engine, who tells him that in order to harness the full power of the crystal he found, he needs 25 smaller crystals scattered around Earth. But with no minions left to gather them, Cortex decides to have Crash gather them for him. Cut to Crash and his new sister Coco relaxing on the beach. Coco's laptop battery dies, she sends Crash to grab a new one, and we're thrust into a small tutorial area, where the player can move around and test out the controls with no fear of dying. A very welcome addition. At the end, Crash is suddenly teleported to the Warp Room, our central hub for the game, ditching the linear progression that the first Crash had. A hologram of Cortex appears, where he tells Crash to collect his first crystal, and then he'll tell him more about why he called him there. The player's then free to choose from any of the 5 levels available in the room, but I decided to go in order, starting with the first level. The basic mechanics are the same as in the first Crash Bandicoot, but with the better jump physics I mentioned before. Crash also has a few new moves, including a crouch, a slide, a high jump, and a belly flop, all mapped to the circle button combined with different movement inputs. Also, if you're playing the Greatest Hits edition like I am, you can control Crash with the analog stick, allowing for more precise movement in the 3D hallway sections, although I found that the D-pad is still better suited for the 2D sections. The bonus round character tokens from Crash 1 have been scrapped and replaced with a dedicated bonus section accessed through clearly marked entrances. Finally, each level has a crystal placed somewhere in it that Crash has to collect in order to progress. But since it's actually possible to skip the crystal, I decided to do that just to see what would happen. I also got the level's box gem, a process that has been made more merciful, just requiring the player to break every box in the stage instead of doing that all in one life. However, the player still has no way of knowing how many boxes there are to break in the stage until they reach the end, so there's still some room for improvement. When I got back to the Warp Room, Cortex berated Crash for missing the crystal, so I went back in and did the level properly this time, which Cortex congratulates for and tells him that he needs Crash to collect every crystal to save the world from an impending catastrophe. Coco then tries to intercept the message to presumably warn Crash not to trust Cortex. Instead of going to level 2, I went back to level 1 again because it has a hidden colored gem. Color gems are collected in specific levels by completing hidden challenges, ranging from walking through a fake wall to find a hidden path, jumping on what appears to be a set of explosive crates but is actually a staircase leading to a warp, to this level's objective, reaching the end without breaking a single box. I like this approach to colored gems, although I have to admit that most of the ways of collecting them are pretty cryptic if you didn't have a guide to tell you where they were. New to the game are Nitro crates, which are like the even more unstable cousin of TNT crates. Unlike TNT crates, which set off a timer when jumped on before they explode, Nitro crates explode instantly on contact. The only way to safely set them off is to either tank a hit with an Aku Aku mask, or hit a green exclamation mark crate somewhere in the stage that will detonate every Nitro crate in the level at once. The environments and character models have seen a massive upgrade, not only in cutscenes, but in-game as well. Crash has new idle animations, will occasionally look back at boulders that are chasing him, a slew of new death animations, and probably the most famous of all, the Crash Dance, which he performs after collecting a gem. The Crash Dance actually debuted in a Japanese ad for the first Crash Bandicoot, and would become a mainstay from this game onward. Crash 2 also introduces more gameplay types to keep the experience varied and interesting. In addition to the returning hallway and side-scrolling sections, alongside the animal riding sections with a cute little polar bear cub, Crash 2 introduces jetboard sections where Crash must ride along the water while dodging obstacles and jumping off ramps, and toward the end of the game, jetpack sections where Crash must move carefully in zero gravity. These jetpack sections are, in my opinion, awful, since the controls aren't intuitive, they're overly sensitive, and the levels are so cramped that they clash with Crash's floaty, momentum-heavy jetpack controls. After collecting every crystal in the warp room, Crash can move on to the next warp room, but along the way he has to fight one of the bosses that Dr. Embryo has sent to stop Crash from collecting the crystals for Cortex. These bosses are mostly uneventful once again, although the fight against Engine stands out for giving Crash the ability to throw an infinite supply of Wumpa Fruit at Engine's mech. As the player progresses through the game, they'll gradually uncover Cortex's scheme to use the crystals in his new Cortex Vortex space station to brainwash the entire population of Earth, and that's where the story recap ends because I couldn't finish the game. See, I got to one of the last levels, but ran into a soft-locking glitch every time in the level's bonus round, and since you need 100% completion to get the ending, I was permanently stuck. That game-ending glitch aside, Crash Bandicoot 2 is a significant improvement over the more rough and experimental Crash 1. Not only has the presentation seen an upgrade, but the controls have also been improved. Gem collecting has been more streamlined, and the game as a whole is far less punishing. And Crash's new moves allow for more interesting level designs and platforming challenges. However, I greatly dislike the jetpack levels, the boss fights are nothing to write home about, the story isn't very engaging, and a few remnants of that Crash 1 jank still remain.
Crash Bandicoot 2 was received even better by critics at the time and sold even more than the original, which, of course, meant that third game was quickly put into production. To wrap up this trilogy, let's take a look at Crash Bandicoot Warped. Oh, sorry, I said that wrong. It's Crash Bandicoot Warped!
Crash Bandicoot Warped picks up with the destruction of Cortex's space station at the end of Crash 2. A piece of it crashes into a temple on Earth, releasing the ancient evil twin brother of Aku Aku, Uka Uka. We learn that Cortex has actually been led by Uka Uka all along, and now that Uka Uka is free, he plans to use the Time Twister machine created by new villain Dr. Nefarious Tropy to collect all of the crystals throughout history to take over the world somehow. Aku Aku, in his first speaking role, instructs Crash and Coco to use the Time Twister to collect all of the crystals before the villains can. Crash Warped continues the warp room setup from Crash 2, divided into groups of 5 levels with a boss after all 5 have been completed. Crash retains all of his moves from Crash 2, along with further tweaked movement and jumping physics, making this Crash feel the easiest to control by far. Once again, you go from beginning to end collecting a crystal in each level, a gem by breaking every box, and extra hidden gems by finding secret routes and a handful of hidden levels. A running tally of how many boxes you've broken out, the total amount in the level has been added, a very welcome addition that makes completionist runs less of a nightmare. New to the collectible counts are relics, which are rewarded to the player after completing each level's time trial challenge, where the player has to get from the beginning to the end in one life as fast as possible, breaking special time stopper crates to temporarily stop the clock and shave precious seconds off your final time. Depending on your time, you can be rewarded with either a sapphire, gold, or the sought-after platinum relic. Relics are required to unlock the last handful of levels in the post-game hidden warp room, but you only need at least a sapphire to unlock them. Getting all gold relics rewards the player with a hidden gem from Coco that bumps the player's completion rating past 100%, while platinum relics are just bragging rights, not unlocking anything special. Variety is the name of the game once again here, but ramped up significantly. In addition to the regular levels and some levels featuring chase sequences, we have the returning animal riding levels, this time putting the player in control of Coco riding a baby tiger across the Great Wall of China, jet ski levels where Coco must navigate around a maze of buoys and obstacles to reach the end, airplane levels where Crash or Coco must shoot down all of the marked targets, motorcycle levels that are the bane of my existence due to their remarkably stiff controls that give Sonic Adventure 2's driving sections a run for their money, and underwater side-scroller levels where Crash must maneuver around sea mines, sharks, and other pests while breaking boxes and occasionally riding this torpedo-launching sub thing. While the number of different gameplay styles may sound overwhelming, none of them overstay their welcome, and they're all balanced out with a healthy amount of basic linear platforming levels. Boss fights have seen a major upgrade. Not only are the fights themselves more challenging, testing the player on their reflexes and pattern recognition skills, but in between levels, each warp room's boss will appear to taunt the player up until their impending battle. This adds some much-needed personality to these characters that were previously just glorified mooks with no defining characteristics outside of how the player fought them. Tiny is given a Hulk-like speech pattern and fierce loyalty to Cortex. Newcomer Dingodile has that Aussie cockiness. Dr. Entropy is pompous and theatrical, and the player even gets to see Cortex gradually go from confident in his ability to stop Crash once and for all, to loathing the impending final duel where he knows he'll inevitably lose again. It makes it all the more satisfying to see Cortex, Uka Uka, and Entropy get warped back to the prehistoric age by the malfunctioning Time Twister, transformed into babies fighting over Uka Uka like a toy. These cutscenes, coupled with the top-notch cartoony voice acting, give Crash Warp the most solid presentation out of the whole trilogy. It's impressive to see just how far Naughty Dog came in just 3 years. New to the game are power-ups that Crash gains after defeating each boss. Some of them are situational, like the Super Belly Flop that increases the impact radius of the move, or the Crash Dash shoes that let Crash run faster and are damn near required for the time trials, while others either aid in platforming, like the admittedly underutilized and awkward to pull off double jump, coupled with the Death Tornado spin that allows Crash to glide over shockingly long distances when timed correctly, or even new offensive moves like the Fruit Bazooka. Later levels are obviously built with Crash's entire unlockable moveset in mind, but these new abilities also aid in making previous levels easier to complete in either time trials or gem runs. Oh, one last thing of note is that entering a cheat code on the title screen unlocks a hidden demo for the first Spyro the Dragon game, since both series were owned and published by Universal Interactive, despite being developed by different studios. This blew my tiny mind when I first discovered it as a kid in an issue of Tips and Tricks magazine, because at the time, the most common way to play demos of upcoming games was either through demo kiosks at your local Walmart, Target, Toys R Us, etc., or by buying demo discs like PlayStation Underground, or this generically titled Interactive CD Sampler disc I got in the mail once. Being able to play a snippet of the game that made me want a PlayStation in the first place just by putting in a button combo on the title screen of one of the first games I ever got with my PlayStation was a welcome treat, to put it lightly.
So overall, how does the Crash Bandicoot PS1 trilogy hold up? And is there any reason to go back to them today? Well,
I can easily say that out of all three, Crash Warped holds up the best of the trilogy, in my humble opinion. It has the best level design, the best controls, the best boss fights, better replay incentives thanks to the time trials, enough variety to keep the player interested, and the difficulty is that perfect balance between challenging and fair. Crash 2 holds up decently as well, but has a few glaring flaws that keep me from recommending it as a starting point for someone looking to get into either Crash Bandicoot or 3D platformers in general. Finally, Crash 1 has aged horrendously thanks to its highly improved sequels, leaving absolutely no reason to revisit it beyond simple curiosity. However, if you're looking to experience the first 3 Crash Bandicoot games but in a more modern form, there's an alternative: the Crash N. Sane Trilogy. Yes, you all knew this was coming. This compilation HD remake of the first 3 Crash games is clearly the definitive way to experience what made Crash Bandicoot so popular in the late 90s. The presentation has seen a monumental upgrade, sometimes looking on par with a Hollywood animated movie. The physics have been tweaked to be consistent around all 3 games, various quality of life changes were made to tone down the more overly punishing aspects, and overall, it's clear that the entire project was a labor of love from the lads over at Vicarious Visions, despite no direct involvement from the original team at Naughty Dog.
even though Naughty Dog gave up on Crash after their contract with Universal was done, that didn't spell the end for the Bandicoot. Even though Crash 4 just recently came out earlier this year at the time of this recording, we're not going there quite yet. No, there's still a whole journey of peaks and valleys to go through on the Bandicoot's run through the 2000s, where he was handed off from developer to developer. And we begin that journey with Crash Bandicoot: The Wrath of Cortex on Xbox, PS2, and GameCube. I'm Haseo, and this is the part of the video where I am legally required to perform the Crash dance because I'm reviewing a Crash Bandicoot game. Oh God, my back.